the concept of controllerism brings up allied questions. What controllers work for what sounds? Well, first of all, we have several thousand years of history of musical instruments. You know, half a century in modern terms of the orchestra, from Monteverdi about 1600, being one of the first people that said, that's not the exact sound I want. I want the ophicleide there, or the sarrusophone, or, you know, that wasn't extant then. But, you know, in other words, in the Renaissance, it was like, well, here's some notes and some music. These are lines. Sing them, play them on crumb horns, play them on kell horns, play them on, so, you know, whatever you have on hand. It's kind of the way it worked. The idea of orchestration, of saying, oh, I want specific sounds, you know, starts to become an ally to the means that control specific sounds. A clarinet is a tube. It's a cylinder, actually, a truncated cylinder, and it produces mostly odd partials, odd harmonics. And therefore, when you hit the register key on a clarinet, it overblows a 12th, not an octave. And it has a square wave-like sound, because square waves have odd harmonics. An oboe is a truncated cone, okay? And it changes a little bit, but it is a cone. And when you take a double reed and you excite that cone, it has all harmonics. And because of the nature of the tube and the size of it, and, you know, a high-pass filter, listen to the bassoon, it's very strangled, it's very high-pass, kind of a narrow little tube to get through. And that you can actually build filters with PVC pipes. I've done it. Low pass, high pass, band pass, you can tune them. So this is what people did empirically, and there were many generations of clarinets before there was the modern BAME system that everybody plays, basically. There certainly were Albert clarinets, there were all kinds of things. And there were many instruments that didn't make it into the orchestra. So the idea of controllerism is bound up with sound, and if we're not careful, we'll forget that. And we'll do as MIDI allows. Here I've got a musical line. It's called notes. And now I think I'll just sprinkle some sounds on top of it, whether they make any sense or not. In other words, there's such a thing as idiomatic musical lines for certain kinds of instruments. I don't think that goes away just because we have electronics. I think as soon as you start having impossibly fast things, you lose any sense of what the instrument is. Just in the way that if you play impossibly high, you really don't have any harmonic structure anymore. The fundamental is about what you're playing. Everything sounds alike. And you can prove this if you take sawtooth, square, pulse, and all this, and you run up the frequency to 10 kilohertz. Well, what's the first harmonic? 20K. Most people can't hear up there. What do you hear? Essentially a kind of a gnarly sine wave. And you don't know whether it's a sawtooth or, in other words, the conditions of hearing and the conditions of enculturation of idiomatic lines means that the oboe has about 2.5 octave range, 20-25 dB dynamic range at best, and yet it will melt your heart. It sounds like a baby crying, you know. It's got that formant at 1K, and it's plaintive and everything, you know. So movie music, people scoff at movie music. It's cliches. That's right, because cliches work. So I tell my students, you know, don't write your autobiography too soon. Learn the cliches first, find out why they work, then find your own voice. Don't go this crazy, you know, I'm 19 years old, I've got to find my voice. No. Find out what's good, what works, then find your voice. For instance, you're doing movie music, and you've got King Arthur and his knights, and they're wearing the horses are wearing those silly skirts, and they're running across the countryside, jumping over stone walls. You don't hear the sound of an oboe. You hear the sound of open fifths and fourths, bum-ba-dee-do-dee-dee-dum, because those would be the kinds of instruments that would be associated literally all the way back to Roman times for that outdoor music and that kind of music. And yet, if you were taking that music for a scene where people were sorrowful, wouldn't work. I mean, it goes beyond controllerism and sound. It goes all the way back to what sounds, in a sense, are not just idiomatic to the clarinet or the trombone. What sounds, in a sense, are idiomatic to human feelings. And there's a certain amount of research that indicates even Aborigines in Australia that you can hardly find anymore that haven't heard Western music. They sense certain things about it, certain moods. They agree with Westerners about it. Very careful to get into this avenue because culture is important. For instance, in some Asian cultures, white is the color of death and mourning. Black, in my culture, the funeral hearse is draped in black. Not so in every culture. So these kinds of determinisms, you have to be very careful. But I like to speculate that it's important not to lose sight of the fact that the limits of human hearing will be limits of controllerism and instruments and so forth. In other words, if the Raleigh seaboard, if the continuum can play small changes in pitch that the ear can't hear, which I don't believe, but and the seaboard can't, then it's not so important for the seaboard. I happen to be able to hear them. I think some people can. As a matter of fact, I will rehearse by holding the note down and playing a passage very slowly until the beats disappear, which means I'm playing in just intonation, getting rid of the rational ratios for harmonics. Okay? I mean, how many people are even cognizant, of such an idea? There you go with pedagogy. In other words, how do we actually even play musical scales? They're not the same all over the world, first of all. Second of all, in Western civilization, we don't play equal temperament when people think we do. And so all of our controllers are oriented toward equal temperament except the ones that allow the deviation under the control of the performer and the ones that allow the deviation of envelope under the control of the performer. You see, on these kinds of instruments, you don't need an envelope generator. You are the envelope. You don't need a scale. You are the scale. And even on orchestral instruments, people say, well, don't they play themselves? You put the button down. Really? Try to keep a job with an orchestra if you believe that. You have to be listening at all times and realizing, yes, the orchestra primarily plays in just intonation. So the whole idea of controllerism and sound brings up a whole galaxy of things to consider. But the one thing I know for sure from MIDI is all sounds don't fit all notes and all musical passages. For the same reasons they didn't fit when we had a group of people, 100 people, playing all these different controllers. They don't fit because they don't make any musical sense to us anymore. And it doesn't mean, I'm trying to imitate the clarinet. No, I'm trying to imitate the clarinet's utility and musicality. That's what I'm trying to do. But marvelous things are obviously going to happen, and controllers will change sound. There's no question. They will do that. Because when you have new possibilities of some of these things, like the KEMA convention I went to, I heard some wonderful new sounds played on new controllers and new means. And I think that's what happens. You don't build any instrument in an abstract situation. You need a community of people who play and a community of people who listen and record and disseminate. And these things, I think, will survive. And we might actually have an orchestra of electronic instruments someday, playing with great nuance and sensitivity. We're close.